So with the road, you can either heat air or you can heat like a glycol solution. It depends on what you're trying to do with it. But basically, you size it to whatever your load is going to be. So it'll be sized to whatever your greatest load is, whether it's heating or cooling. So you'd have to do a heat analysis, both for the summer and for the winter, and then from there determine how much air or fluid you had to push through the system in order to accomplish your goals. Yeah. Access on the property, but actually you raised a really good point. I forgot a point in number 2. Most people do not think about land use bylaw, okay? And land use bylaw can actually have a lot of, can really implicate how you gain access to the property, especially if you're on main thoroughfares. So before you buy a property, you have to look at whether or not you have direct access if you're off a main highway, or if you're going to require an easement to get onto that property. But generally when we talk about access, we talk about roads for cars, tractors, or footpaths. That's the second thing that has to be sorted out before anything else. And another way of thinking about it is that once you know where your water systems are going to go, so we have lots of different ways of harvesting water. Swales are an example that you may have heard of, or ponds, or dugouts as they're referred to in Alberta. Access, or roads, are actually water harvesting surfaces. So we all love to hate pavement and roads and criticize them for what they are. The reason we don't like roads, at least as progressive people, is because we only look at any particular element in any particular system for its single purpose or use. If you look at a road as a heat harvesting element, so it picks up heat from the environment, so it changes the microclimate, as a water harvesting surface, so something that's going to enhance catchment in a pond or infiltrate water into the ground, and as access, all of a sudden that $6,000 road that you have to put in, if it's properly designed, is an amazing element. I mean, I've even seen farmers who plant all of their nut trees along roads. Why? Because it's way easier to harvest nuts on a hard surface than it is to harvest it in the middle of a field. So it's all about multifunction in everything that we do, and that comes right back down to integration and design. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. People think always about warmth, but they don't think about coolth. So part of integrating on a landscape could be placing buildings behind a shelter belt or trees, especially to the south, specifically deciduous trees, so that in the summertime you have shade and in the wintertime you've got sun. If that's not a possibility, or it's going to take you a really long time to grow those trees. The other thing that you'll notice if you guys drive around this city and you look at infills is that we are sacrificing eaves for square footage, because square footage is how we sell homes. So the more square feet you have, the higher you can sell your price, the higher you can sell your house for. So good design in this climate for thermodynamic reasons requires you to have eaves like your grandparents would have had 100 years ago, so that when you've got sun hitting the building or any kind of window, it's rejecting it in the summertime and it's absorbing it in the winter. Now in a shop, if you don't have a lot of windows, the color of the shop can make a difference. So if you take all those Greek buildings, those white ones that you find on Santorini or any of those islands, if you paint one of those buildings brown, all of the R&D that's happened over the last 5, 6, 7,000 years that went into building those types of buildings is out the door. The white surface on those buildings allows it to slowly gain heat through the day and release it at night when it's cold, and then vice versa. So all throughout the day, it's building up heat to get it through the night, and all through the night, it's releasing that heat back to space in order to have it cool through the day. So color makes a big difference. And then if you've got color, you've got eaves, and maybe you've got some shelter. The other thing that I see wrong so often, and people cheap out on this because it's one of the most expensive parts of the home, are windows, operable windows. So every home should have larger windows in the top than they do in the bottom, so that you can get a natural stack effect going on in there. And then if you integrate that stack effect with earth tubes, now the vacuum that you create with the stack effect in your building can naturally bring in cooled air from the driveway without ever having to employ an electric fan. So some simple things that you can do to retrofit that. And then in addition to that, with integrating, you can actually store thermal energy below your slab with various types of systems. So if your building is getting to 85, why dump it outside? Put it into a thermodynamically retarded system, like it retards itself, so that the heat that you store in the middle of the summer is released in the shoulder seasons and the winter. There's all sorts of stuff that we can do to manage the thermodynamic loads, both hot and cold in a building. And both need to be considered, and any kind of air conditioner in this climate is a lack of design. I'm not saying you have to go to passive house, it's just one example that tends to work really well. They want less than 0.5 air changes per hour. That's really tight. That's like a Rubbermaid container. You know, most of our homes are so leaky that if you took all of the holes and combined it into one hole, we'd have a space like this big round that's just letting air out of our house. So that's good in the sense that there's lots of fresh air coming into our home, although we don't have a lot of control over where the fresh air is coming from. So that fresh air could be passing through moldy bats of insulation. It could be coming through our door. It could be coming from our garage, and there could be car exhaust back there where somebody is smoking. So we kind of want to have control of where our ventilation is coming from. And so there's hyper efficient heat recovery ventilators that are available on the market now. And what happens when you get to passive house standard, if you look at any conventionally built home in this city right now, they have a $15,000 to $20,000 HVAC system in it. So that's a fan unit, a natural gas burner, and then all the ancillary ductwork to take the air around the house, plus the returns. When you get into a passive house, because the envelope's so good, you can actually heat the home with your heat recovery ventilator. So what that means is that these giant furnaces, they're like big Suburbans, okay? They're like massive SUVs in your house. They have to push huge amount of air around the building because air doesn't hold very much heat in order to keep your house warm. But when you get a really efficient home where you have control over the air exchange in the building, we can take the amount of air that you have to push around the home and shrink it down dramatically. And so now all of the heat delivery in your house is by a small little tiny unit that can run off a solar array. Like we're talking 30, 40 watts of power, almost nothing. Instead of your big furnace, which requires quite a bit more both thermal energy but also fan power energy to run all the air through the building. But you're absolutely right. If you build a really tight building, you have to have that air management. There are some advantages to building with straw, for example, or various types of natural building materials. Those materials tend to breathe quite a bit more than what I would call industrial building materials. So I am personally quite attracted to building with straw on the prairie. However, I always let my landscape dictate, or not always, a lot of the time I'll let my landscape dictate the type of building that I'll build. So we talk about local food. Why are we talking about local building materials? So what are the local building materials in the prairie? Straw and concrete, sure. Clay, sand. We've got a recipe for cob and straw. Those are fantastic. And straw has a really nice R value, almost R40. So you can do some really great things with straw in a really low embodied energy. And the other thing that appeals to me with straw is that I can build almost debt-free because it's right around me all the time. They're very inexpensive building materials. So, yeah. Well, technically, in our province, we're not legally allowed to drink rainwater. The way the policy sits right now is rainwater can only be used for toilet flushing and subsurface irrigation. So you don't really have a choice. As far as, well, your two choices are essentially drill a well or truck your water in. I think that it's crazy that we only have one water source. It's nuts. Like, if you think about the flood again a couple years ago, I had more rain in my cisterns at my urban property than I've ever had. And we were on the verge as a city of having to shut the water system down because of contamination. And I always set my rainwater harvesting systems up to be potable. And I could set them up on any roof that way, pretty much, other than like wood or cedar or copper. But any other roof surface we can make potable. And it's like another $100 to do it. So I think having a resilient supply of water is really important. And then if you are going to consume well water, do it responsibly. The Alberta government has monitoring points on thousands of wells right across the province. And some parts of the province, the water is generally trending upwards. But a large part of especially southern Alberta, it's pretty scary how quickly the water is actually trending downwards. So we all think about consuming water, but we don't think very often about putting it back into the ground. So that raises the point, well, how do we put it back in the ground? Well, our best water harvesting surface is carbon-rich soil. And that comes right back down to how we're actually managing the landscape. So not using rototillers, having continuous live root, always having a live plant there, properly grazing grassland if you have grassland, putting forests back where they belong. And there's ways that we can expedite that using more mechanical water harvesting features like swales, ponds, things like that. Yeah. Yep. You have to do a lot of research into the type of window that you buy. Generally speaking, a lot of the window manufacturers in North America misrepresent the R value of their window. And so there's two factors that you have to look at when you look at any window, and that is the pane itself and the frame. And it's the net R value of those two elements that's super crucial. When you net it out, if you have an R value, typically passive home windows are in the 8 range, which is unheard of for a window. So you're looking at usually like 2 or 3 for a double pane or even a triple glaze window. But to get passive, we need to actually get up to almost R8. And so the way they do that is they have very, very specifically built seals on operable windows and insulation within the frame so that the building insulation properly integrates with the window. And then the other kind of big mistake that people make in passive solar buildings is they overglaze. So they get, and this is usually the men that do this as well. And actually it's two reasons. It's men and it's view. We tend to really go hard on the view. So we put really, really big windows. But you're actually better off, I'm not saying you can't have big windows, but you should dictate the size of the window based on a heat analysis. So we stop looking at windows as just something to look out of. We start looking at them as our primary heating source. So we take the $15,000 or $20,000 that we were going to invest in an SUV heating system, and we put it into our windows. So the incremental cost on the European windows doesn't seem as painful anymore because we don't have the $20,000 invested in a natural gas furnace. And then we properly orient them and we run it through an energy model to see how the building is going to respond to our weather patterns. making sure that it doesn't overheat or get too cold. I mean, you can have northern windows. However, you just have to take into account for it in your energy model, and you just have to look at how you're going to manage that. So, yeah. Okay, two things about wind. I spent 6 months in Denmark at one of the preeminent, or most well-known, I should say, renewable energy centers. And most of my time there was fixing small wind turbines. When you look at wind and wave energy, one of the reasons that they're really hard, especially the smaller scale ones, is that you get very large variations. And so when you're mechanically designing a wind turbine, you have to account for you always have to design to your largest load. And so that can make the design really, really challenging. And so there are a lot of wind turbines out there that just literally fail. There's only a couple ones that I would recommend using.
It's just a supplement.
Yeah, it's a backup system, right? A lot of, I think you're not going to see the end of wind, but primarily our energy in the future is going to come from solar. Because even if wind was cheaper on a kilowatt for kilowatt basis, a photovoltaic array has no moving parts. It can double as a rainwater harvesting surface. It can act as wind shelter for your building. You know, there's so many things that you can do with it. It's solid state, and so I'd rather put up more panels, because there's no moving parts, than put up a wind turbine. And plus the noise thing's not really an issue. It's kind of like a false issue that people come up with to try and prevent towers from going up. By the time you can hear a wind turbine, the wind is so loud that you can't hear anything else. So you're actually hearing the wind, not the turbine itself. And generally, I mean, living in really windy areas produces a lot of challenges. So personally, I try and find places that are probably not suitable for wind, just so that I can grow my food. But that's not always an option. So you kind of have to work with what you got. Yeah. And then Tesla's batteries, you know, they just created I was just talking to one of my friends who installs solar. It's funny how this all works, but they just put a tariff on Chinese solar panels. And if you've purchased a Chinese solar panel between now and August of 2014, so that's actually retroactive, they're coming back to you and saying you have to pay a bunch more money on them, even though you've already purchased them, because they've talked about how Chinese have been dumping solar panels on the market, which is just, in my opinion, a way of trying to slow the progression of solar. Solar right now, with the combination, I mean, Walmart, you can always look at companies like Walmart. Walmart is now buying Tesla batteries because they don't pay a fixed per kilowatt hour rate. They pay a variable rate based on the amount of demand that they have. So they buy all their power at night, store them in Tesla batteries, and the cost differential between the high and the low cost allows them to save copious amounts of money running those battery systems. So the world is changing, and I've been saying this for a long time. Within 5 years, almost every surface will be covered in solar, or it'll be well on its way. And as soon as Tesla gets his batteries down to the $250 to $1,000 per kilowatt hour of storage, even if the battery system is $30,000 bucks, okay, so $1,000 a kilowatt hour, that battery system is going to last for 30 some years, likely. So you're basically buying all of your fuel right now at today's prices for a very long time into the future. And you can get out of the whole dramatic oil scene. You don't have to worry about the price of oil or whether your lights are going to come on, because you've got a system that's super robust. And I love the other argument that people always give about batteries or solar panels is how much energy did it take to build them? How much energy did it take to build a coal plant? Will that coal plant ever pay back the energy that it took to build it? No. It constantly needs more in the form of coal. And last time I checked, we haven't found any clean coal seams. So clean coal technology is a bit of a farce. Having said that, I'm very grateful that we have it because we have power tonight. So we can't demonize our power sources too much. Number one, I would do a solar assessment on the property. That's really easy to do. So there's lots of design stuff that you can do to test how much photovoltaic would be possible. Although I've been out there in the winter. Your options out there are micro hydro, which can be a pain in the butt if it gets really cold. Wood gasification, biodiesel, or rely on the giant hydro dam just down the road. That's probably not going anywhere anytime soon. So what's interesting about the West Kootenays is that if anything ever went down out there, everybody would have little micro hydro turbines set up in no time. And so I wouldn't be too worried about it. And there's always candles, so I mean, the power grid in BC is really good. So I don't know if that'd be the first place that I'd put my money. Yeah. In an ideal situation, you would observe it for a year, but that's not always possible. And so there's tools that you can use to give you, like your water systems you can figure out pretty quickly.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But generally, the development of the property is going to happen in stages anyways.
Mm-hmm.
So you likely won't do all of the water systems to begin with, just because of cost or available time. But absolutely, if you can afford a year to observe, I think there's a lot of merit to that.
You can always, I mean, pull the plug and sell it again if you like. You know what, I can't, this would be better for cattle. I don't want to get into cattle, so sell it and move somewhere else.
I would say choose the piece of land right from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so a couple of the things that I look for when I'm looking for a piece of land are, what's the climate like? Are there ancillary sources of water that we can harvest? So is there water flowing through the ditches? Are there seasonal drainages? What are all the water sources that the property has available to it? Are there ways that you can harvest that water and bring it onto the property, integrate it, infiltrate it into the soil, or store it in above surface storages? And so those types of things you can assess from day one. You can look at plant communities. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that you can do right away. So first of all, I'd say buy the right piece of property. And then if you're planning on building yourself, the best thing you can do is figure out what style of building you're going to use for that property, which again will be water access structures that helps you to figure that out. And build a small building that you can live in that's impossible to live in for more than a year or two. So you don't get too comfortable, but comfortable enough so that you don't go nuts. And then use that initial building to learn how you're going to build your primary building. And then you have that year of observation, you're on the property, you don't have to deal with 2 mortgages. And then if you can't afford the land, there's all sorts of innovative things you can do as well. You don't have to go and buy the land. There's ways of having security without security in tenure, without owning the land and having to go through a banking process. If you're willing to explore some interesting options. Yeah. And you can still end up owning the land down the road. You just don't have to necessarily go through the banks. Well, you have to be really clear on your goals, and you have to understand if one of your goals is agroecology, so the integration of ecosystem design and agriculture, which is kind of what permaculture is, then you have to understand how, like, the intersection point between your goals, the agroecological opportunities on the property, and sometimes people actually put a third piece in there to try and make money off of their property. We're actually helping a farmer right now to mesh their passions, their desire to grow food, and trying to find market for their food so that they actually run a profitable farm. I like to separate design into 3 components. So there's feasibility, or what I call mainframe. So these are the broad strokes. Broad strokes are, if you've looked at enough land, are fairly easy to get right from the beginning. That's the mainframe. And once you've got the mainframe set up, then you move into detailed design. So this is like sorting out all the little tiny details. Like, it's kind of like, if you think about your property as a closet organizer, okay, the mainframe are all the little cubby holes. Okay, so those cubby holes, you're trying to find a piece of land that will fit all of your clothing accessories. Okay, and your clothing accessories are your goals. Once you've got the closet organizer set up on the property, then you have to figure out how to best place your accessories within the closet to optimize water use, microclimate, proximity to the main home, or proximity to access, or a number of different factors. So you can set up water, access, and structures. That's your mainframe. You can set up your home relatively quickly, especially in this climate. It's pretty consistent. Southern Alberta is pretty consistent. Northern Alberta is pretty consistent in terms of where winds come from, where the sun's coming from, all that stuff. And then from there, you can observe how things start to take shape, and then get into the details. And you can take time to sort the details out.
So it would realistically, would you say, like, sort of like 2 a year?
To any perennial food system, so trees are generally going to, like, we would set them up in things like food forests or orchards even, 5 years minimum. And your productivity is not going to be great at 5 years. Your productivity is really going to start taking off around 10 years. So it's really an investment into the future. And so you need to have multiple strategies. So we think in terms of space, we think in terms of time, and we think in terms of not just horizontal space, but 3-dimensional space. So how do we utilize all dimensions, including the temporal dimension? And then placement as well, so relative to the primary energy source on the property, which is human energy. So how are you going to manage that property without driving yourself absolutely bonkers? A lot of that stuff can be sorted out right from the beginning. Yeah. Okay, I'll take one more and then I'm done. Yeah. I have direct experience with both earthships and living in something that's like an earthship. There's a great book called A Pattern Language. Anybody heard of that? One of the best books ever written on the design of structures and human space generally. A Pattern Language. So if you're in a space where you don't have windows on both sides, or you don't have windows in the right locations, let's say. So there's locations, you put windows in a home for heating, but then you also put windows in a home for mental sanity. That's just as important, because you got to live in this space for a long time. When you're in an earthship or some sort of earth-sheltered building, there's only light coming in from one direction. So you can, and I would encourage anybody that wants to build one to go down and live in one for a couple of weeks to see if you feel as though you're living in a prison cell. They can feel very, I live in one right now, not an earthship, but we retrofitted our house and I learned the lesson the hard way. I learned my lesson about ventilation. So under-ventilating my house in terms of not putting enough operable windows, taking out northern windows that I felt were inefficient as an engineer, but took away an important portal to the outside world that actually was providing me with a lot of mental sanity. And so I feel like I'm in a bit of a prison sometimes based on how my walls and windows are oriented. So you need to think about that. And that's really the case for interior design, or having somebody who understands, or reading the book, A Pattern Language. So I think that those type of homes can feel very constricting. And it's like living, I mean, I live in a basement suite too, on top of that. So live in a basement for a few years and see how you like that. They're horrible places to live. And so I actually don't recommend anybody build basements. And so coming back to the goals, one of the clients that I'm working with right now came to me wanting an earthship. And when we really kind of got to the core of their goals, it was like, well, they didn't want to live in an earthship. That was just the only building that they found that met their sustainability goals. So when I told her, I was like, what if you didn't have to worry about sustainability? What kind of house would you want to live in? Farmhouse. Okay. So let's use this design philosophy, build you a farmhouse that meets all of your aesthetic criteria and all of your sustainability criteria. So that's why it's so important to have your goal statement, because you can get locked into an idea that there's only one way of solving a problem and end up sacrificing other facets of your life that are really important. And that's actually one of the biggest values that we bring to our clients, is we look at their goals, we look at their biases, and everybody here has a bias, including me, and then we call them on it. We say, you've got biases right here. This is what you want in your goal statement. This bias is actually conflicting with your goal statement, and you're not going to be happy. So let's work on this thing first. Let's start diagnosing the problem properly, and then create a solution that meets all of your needs, not just a few of them. So you have to really always ask yourself, am I choosing this because of some preconceived bias? Like I want to star in The Lord of the Rings or something like that.